They kicked her off the plane for being suspicious. Minutes later, when 180 passengers faced certain death from multiple system failures, the desperate pilot radioed, "We need Falcon." The quiet woman they'd humiliated was their only hope, a legendary combat pilot whose call sign commanded instant respect worldwide. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Sarah Chin stood at gate 47, holding her boarding pass with steady hands while chaos erupted around her. The gate agent's voice crackled over the speakers for the third time in 10 minutes, announcing another delay for Flight 892 to Los Angeles. Passengers grumbled and checked their phones, but Sarah remained calm, her dark eyes scanning the crowded terminal with the quiet alertness of someone trained to notice everything. She wore simple clothes, dark jeans, a plain black jacket, and worn sneakers that had walked through more danger zones than anyone could guess. At 34, Sarah had the kind of unremarkable appearance that made people look right through her. Average height, shoulder-length black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, no makeup or jewelry. She looked like any other tired traveler trying to get home after a long business trip. What nobody knew was that Sarah Chin was one of the most decorated combat pilots in U.S. military history. Her call sign, Falcon, was legendary among elite aviation circles. She had flown over 200 combat missions in some of the world's most dangerous airspace, rescued downed pilots behind enemy lines, and commanded special operations that were still classified years later. The small scar above her left eyebrow came from ejecting from a burning fighter jet over hostile territory. The slight limp in her right leg was from a crash landing that saved an entire ground unit from enemy fire. But today she was just another passenger trying to catch a flight home to see her sick mother. "Attention passengers," the gate agent announced, sounding stressed and overwhelmed. "Due to overbooking issues, we need several volunteers to take a later flight. We're offering travel vouchers and hotel accommodations." Sarah glanced at her ticket again. C-12A. She had booked this flight weeks ago and really needed to get home tonight. Her mother was having surgery in the morning, and Sarah had promised to be there. After 3 tours of duty and countless classified missions, she rarely made promises about being somewhere. But this one mattered. The gate agent, a young woman named Lisa who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, began calling names. "Sarah Chin, please approach the gate desk." Sarah walked forward, already sensing trouble from the agent's tight expression and the security guard who had appeared nearby. Other passengers stared as she approached, wondering what she had done wrong. "Ma'am, I'm afraid there's been a problem with your booking," Lisa said without looking up from her computer screen. "We're going to need you to take a later flight." "I booked this flight 3 weeks ago and checked in online this morning," Sarah replied calmly. "My boarding pass shows seat 12A. Lisa's fingers clicked rapidly on her keyboard, her frustration obvious. "Yes, well, there's been an issue with our booking system. We're overbooked by 4 passengers and unfortunately, you're going to have to take the 10:30 p.m. flight instead." "Is there a specific reason I'm being selected?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice level despite growing concern. She noticed how Lisa avoided eye contact and how the security guard had moved closer. "The computer system selects passengers based on various factors," Lisa said dismissively. "Booking class, frequent flyer status, check-in time. You don't qualify for priority boarding." This wasn't true and Sarah knew it. She had been a frequent traveler for years and had status with the airline. Something else was happening here. She noticed a supervisor approaching, a middle-aged man with a badge that read Frank Morrison, Customer Service Manager. "Is there a problem here?" Frank asked, but he was looking at Sarah like she was the problem. "I'm just trying to understand why I'm being removed from a flight I booked weeks ago," Sarah said quietly. Frank glanced at Lisa's computer screen, then at Sarah, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, we have security concerns about your travel pattern. You've taken several international flights recently, including routes through the Middle East. Our screening protocols require additional verification for passengers with your travel history." The accusation hung in the air like poison. Sarah felt the stares of other passengers, heard the whispers starting. In their eyes she was becoming suspicious, potentially dangerous. The irony was bitter. She had risked her life serving her country in those same Middle Eastern regions Frank mentioned, but now her service record was being used against her. "I understand you have security procedures," Sarah said, her military training keeping her voice steady. "What additional verification do you need?" Frank's expression didn't soften. "Unfortunately, we don't have time to complete the additional screening before departure. You'll need to rebook on tomorrow's flight and go through enhanced security protocols." Sarah felt her heart sink. Tomorrow would be too late. Her mother's surgery was scheduled for 8 a.m., and this was the last flight that would get her there in time. She looked around at the boarding area, seeing how other passengers were watching her like she was a threat. A businessman clutched his laptop bag tighter. A mother pulled her children closer. They all assumed the airline had good reasons for removing her. "Please," Sarah said, and it was one of the few times in her life she had begged for anything. "My mother is having surgery tomorrow morning. I need to be there." "I'm sorry, but we can't make exceptions," Frank said, not sounding sorry at all. "Security regulations exist for everyone's protection." The security guard stepped forward, a large man with tired eyes who looked like he'd dealt with difficult passengers all day. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and come with me." Sarah realized that arguing would only make things worse. Years of military discipline had taught her when to fight and when to retreat. This wasn't a battle she could win with words. She shouldered her small backpack, the same one she'd carried on combat missions, and followed the security guard away from the gate. As they walked through the terminal, Sarah heard the gate agent announcing that boarding would begin shortly. The passengers who had watched her removal were already forgetting about her, focused on getting on the plane. She was nobody to them, just another problem passenger who had been dealt with. But Sarah Chin wasn't nobody. In certain circles, the call sign Falcon commanded instant respect and recognition. She had earned that name during her first combat tour when she had spotted an enemy ambush from 15 miles away and saved an entire convoy. Her eyesight and reflexes were legendary. Her ability to stay calm under impossible pressure had made her a natural leader in the most dangerous situations. During her second tour, Falcon had single-handedly held off enemy fighters while a rescue helicopter evacuated wounded soldiers from a hot landing zone. She had been outnumbered 4-1 but had used superior tactics and flying skills to keep the enemy at bay until everyone was safe. The mission had earned her the Distinguished Flying Cross and the respect of pilots throughout the military. Her third and final tour had been the most classified. Falcon had led special operations deep behind enemy lines, flying missions so secret that even now, years later, she couldn't discuss them with anyone. She had rescued captured American soldiers, destroyed high-value targets, and gathered intelligence that had prevented terrorist attacks on American soil. When she finally left active duty, her commanding officer had told her she was the best pilot he had ever seen. But none of that mattered now as she sat in the airport's administrative office, waiting while Frank Morrison made phone calls about her case. Through the window she could see Flight 892 being prepared for departure. Baggage carts rolled across the tarmac and fuel trucks finished their work. Her seat 12A would remain empty while some other passenger got bumped up from the waiting list. "Miss Chin," Frank said, hanging up his phone, "I've spoken with our security department. Unfortunately, given your travel history and the current threat level, we cannot authorize your travel today. You're welcome to rebook for tomorrow and go through the additional screening process then." Sarah looked at him steadily. "What exactly about my travel history concerns you?" Frank shifted uncomfortably. "You've made multiple trips to Iraq, Afghanistan, and other Middle Eastern countries over the past few years. Our algorithms flag patterns like that for additional review." "Those were work trips," Sarah said quietly. "What kind of work requires multiple trips to active war zones?" Frank asked suspiciously. Sarah couldn't tell him. Her contract work for the government was classified. The consulting she did for defense contractors involved sensitive information she couldn't discuss. The truth that she was helping train Allied pilots and plan strategic operations was not something she could reveal to an airline manager who thought her service record made her suspicious. "I can't discuss the details," she said, "but I can assure you I pose no threat to anyone." Frank's expression hardened further. That's exactly what someone who posed a threat would say. Outside the window, Sarah watched Flight 892 push back from the gate. She had failed. For all her combat experience and military training, she couldn't overcome airline bureaucracy and post-9/11 paranoia. Her mother would face surgery alone tomorrow morning, wondering why her daughter had broken a promise for the first time in years. Flight 892 taxied toward the runway as Sarah gathered her belongings to leave the airport. She would rent a car and drive through the night, arriving hours after her mother's surgery was over. It wasn't the same as being there to hold her hand before she went under anesthesia, but it was all she could do now. The aircraft disappeared from view as it headed toward the active runway. Sarah was walking toward the parking garage when her phone buzzed with a news alert. "Breaking! Flight 892 reports emergency after takeoff." Her blood turned cold. She turned back toward the terminal, her military instincts kicking in. Through the massive windows she could see airport personnel running, emergency vehicles racing across the tarmac with lights flashing. Something was very wrong. Sarah ran back into the terminal, her backpack bouncing as she moved with the fluid urgency of someone trained for crisis situations. The gate area was in chaos. Passengers who hadn't boarded were crying and making frantic phone calls. Gate agents were gathered around radios, their faces pale with stress. What happened? Sarah asked Lisa, the gate agent who had removed her from the flight. We've lost contact with Flight 892, Lisa said, her voice shaking. They declared an emergency about 10 minutes after takeoff. Something about multiple system failures and loss of hydraulic pressure. Sarah's mind raced. Multiple system failures were catastrophic in commercial aviation. Without hydraulic pressure, the pilots would lose control of essential flight systems: landing gear, flaps, steering, brakes. The aircraft would be extremely difficult to control, and landing would be nearly impossible. Are they returning to this airport? Sarah asked. We don't know, Lisa replied. Air traffic control is trying to establish communication. The pilot's last transmission was... She checked her notes. Engine fire, multiple system failures, requesting immediate emergency landing. Sarah felt her chest tighten. There were 180 passengers and crew aboard Flight 892. People with families, dreams, lives that mattered. The same kind of people she had spent years protecting during her military service. And she had been supposed to be on that plane in seat 12A, probably helping coordinate passenger responses during the emergency. Frank Morrison appeared beside them, looking frazzled and overwhelmed. Air traffic control is asking if we have any information about passengers with emergency response training who were booked on this flight. They're trying to identify anyone who might be able to help from the ground or... He stopped mid-sentence, looking at Sarah with sudden recognition. The pieces were falling into place. Her calm demeanor during the removal process, her mysterious work trips to war zones, her unexplained confidence in high-stress situations. Miss Chin, Frank said slowly. What exactly did you do during your work trips overseas? Sarah looked at him steadily. I flew. Commercial flights? No. Frank's phone rang. He answered it quickly, speaking in urgent, clipped sentences. Sarah could hear parts of the conversation from air traffic control. The situation was getting worse. Flight 892 was losing altitude and struggling to maintain level flight. The pilots were dealing with multiple emergencies simultaneously and running out of options. They're asking about anyone with military aviation experience, Frank said, looking directly at Sarah now. Any pilots, navigators, air traffic controllers who might be able to provide guidance. Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Put me in contact with air traffic control. Are you qualified to help with this situation? Yes. Frank hesitated for only a moment before handing her his phone. The air traffic controller's voice was tense with urgency. This is Denver Control. We have Flight 892 in severe distress. Multiple system failures, partial engine failure, hydraulic problems. The crew is overwhelmed and requesting any available assistance. This is Sarah Chin, she said calmly into the phone. I have experience with emergency aircraft recovery procedures. What's their current situation? Who is this? The controller asked. Are you qualified to assist with commercial aviation emergencies? Sarah looked around at the crowded gate area, at the crying passengers and stressed airline personnel. She made another decision that would reveal who she really was. This is Falcon, she said, using her military call sign for the first time in civilian context. I need to speak with Flight 892 immediately. The silence on the other end of the phone was complete. Then, did you say Falcon? That's correct. Stand by, Falcon. We're patching you through to Flight 892 right now. Frank Morrison stared at Sarah with growing amazement. Lisa, the gate agent, had gone completely pale. Other airline personnel were gathering around, sensing that something important was happening. The name Falcon was clearly meaningful to the air traffic controller, but none of them understood why. The radio crackled, and suddenly Sarah was listening to the cockpit of Flight 892. The pilot's voice was strained with stress and physical exhaustion from fighting unresponsive controls. Denver Control, this is Flight 892. We have multiple system failures. Engine number 2 is shut down with fire indications. We've lost most hydraulic pressure. Flight controls are extremely difficult to manage. We're having trouble maintaining altitude and need immediate assistance with emergency landing procedures. Flight 892, this is Denver Control, came the controller's voice. We have Falcon on the line to provide assistance. There was a pause. Then the pilot's voice came back, filled with sudden hope and recognition. Falcon? The Falcon. That's correct, Flight 892. What's your current altitude and airspeed? Falcon, we're at 8,000 feet, descending at 500 feet per minute. Airspeed is 180 knots and climbing. We can't control our descent rate properly. The aircraft wants to pitch down and we're fighting it constantly. Sarah's mind shifted into combat mode. She had dealt with similar situations in military aircraft, though never in a commercial jetliner with 180 passengers. But the principles were the same: assess the situation, prioritize the most critical problems, and develop a plan that gave everyone the best chance of survival. Flight 892, I need you to reduce power on your remaining engine and use elevator trim to help control your pitch attitude. Don't try to maintain altitude right now. Let the aircraft descend in a controlled manner while you work on getting your systems back online. Falcon, we're worried about losing too much altitude. We're not sure we can get it back. I understand your concern, but fighting the aircraft is using up your strength and making the situation worse. Work with the aircraft's tendencies instead of against them. How much fuel do you have remaining? About 45 minutes at current consumption rate. Sarah did quick calculations in her head. They had enough fuel for multiple approach attempts, but not much time to experiment with different techniques. Every minute of delay reduced their options and increased the risk of catastrophic system failures. Flight 892, I want you to declare a full emergency and request vectors to the longest runway available. Do not attempt a normal approach. We're going to use modified military procedures for emergency landings with compromised flight controls. By now, a crowd had gathered around Sarah at the gate. Frank Morrison was on another phone, apparently explaining the situation to airline executives. Lisa was staring at Sarah like she was seeing a ghost. Other passengers were filming with their phones, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Falcon, this is Captain Williams and Flight 892. I have to ask, are you military? Former military, Sarah replied calmly. I've dealt with similar emergency situations in combat aircraft. The principles are the same for commercial planes, but we need to modify the approach for your aircraft type and passenger load. What's your background, Falcon? Sarah glanced around at all the people listening to her conversation. Her classified service record was about to become very public. Combat pilot, 3 tours overseas, special operations. I've successfully recovered aircraft from multiple system failures, enemy damage, and extreme weather conditions. The relief in Captain Williams' voice was obvious. Falcon, we're putting our lives in your hands. What do you need us to do? Sarah stepped away from the crowd, needing space to concentrate on the technical aspects of the emergency. Frank Morrison followed her, still holding his phone and apparently coordinating with multiple agencies. The situation had escalated beyond airline management and was now involving FAA emergency response teams, airport fire and rescue units, and who knew what other agencies. Flight 892, first I need a complete status report on all your aircraft systems. Engine status, hydraulic pressure readings, electrical systems, flight controls, landing gear, and any warning lights or abnormal indications. For the next 5 minutes, Captain Williams provided a detailed report that painted a grim picture. They had lost their number 2 engine completely, hydraulic pressure was at 30% of normal levels, electrical systems were functioning but unstable, flight controls required enormous physical strength to operate, and they hadn't yet tested whether their landing gear would extend properly. Falcon, we're not sure this aircraft can be landed safely, Captain Williams admitted. We're considering recommending that passengers prepare for emergency water ditching. Negative on water ditching, Sarah said firmly. Your aircraft type has poor water landing characteristics, and passenger survival rates would be very low. We're going to get you on the ground at an airport. She turned to Frank Morrison. I need to speak with airport operations immediately. They need to phone the runway, have maximum emergency equipment standing by, and clear all other traffic from the airport. This is going to be a high-speed approach with possible runway overrun. Frank nodded and made rapid phone calls. Sarah could hear him explaining that they had a military expert named Falcon coordinating the emergency response. The name was apparently opening doors and getting immediate cooperation from airport authorities. Flight 892, we're going to use a technique called a modified straight-in approach, Sarah explained. Instead of trying to configure your aircraft for a normal landing, we're going to come in hot and fast, using your remaining engine power and momentum to maintain control. You'll touch down at higher than normal speed, but that's better than losing control during a slow approach. Falcon, that sounds extremely dangerous with passengers aboard. It is dangerous, Sarah admitted, but it's less dangerous than the alternatives. I've used this technique in combat situations when aircraft were too damaged for normal landings. The key is precise speed and altitude management during the final approach. Sarah spent the next 10 minutes walking Captain Williams through the modified approach technique, explaining how to use power settings, aircraft attitude, and descent rate to maintain control despite the compromised systems. It was complex and counterintuitive compared to normal commercial flying procedures, but it was their best chance for survival. "Falcon, we're starting our approach now," Captain Williams reported. "Altitude 3,000 feet, airspeed 200 knots, aircraft is responding sluggishly but we have control." Sarah listened to the approach with the focused intensity she had learned during combat missions. Every radio transmission told her something about the aircraft's condition and the crew's stress level. Captain Williams was following her instructions precisely, but she could hear the strain in his voice as he fought the damaged aircraft. "Flight 892, you're doing great. Reduce power slightly and let your airspeed come back to 190 knots. Don't worry about being fast, we want that extra energy in case you encounter wind shear or downdrafts close to the ground. Falcon, we have the runway in sight. It looks like they've foamed it and emergency equipment is standing by." "Perfect. Continue your approach. When you're 100 feet above the runway, I want you to reduce power to idle and let the aircraft settle. Don't try to flare for a soft landing, just let it come down firmly. Use maximum reverse thrust and brakes as soon as you touch down." The next 60 seconds felt like an eternity. Sarah could hear the strain in the engines, the stress in Captain Williams' voice, and the muted sounds of flight attendants preparing passengers for emergency landing. 180 lives hung in the balance, depending on her expertise and Captain Williams' skill in executing an approach technique that was never designed for commercial aircraft. "Falcon, we're touching down now." Sarah heard the rumble of tires hitting pavement, the roar of reverse thrust, and the controlled chaos of an emergency landing. Then Captain Williams' voice came back, filled with emotion and relief. "Falcon, we're down safe. Aircraft is stopped on the runway. All passengers and crew appear to be okay. Emergency vehicles are approaching." The gate area erupted in cheers and applause. Passengers who had been crying with worry were now laughing and hugging strangers. Gate agents were wiping away tears of relief. Frank Morrison was shaking Sarah's hand and apologizing profusely for removing her from the flight. "Miss Falcon, I cannot begin to apologize for what happened earlier. If I had known who you were." Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "You followed your procedures. But maybe it's time to review those procedures and consider whether they're actually making anyone safer." Lisa, the gate agent who had removed Sarah from the flight, approached with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I was just following orders, but I should have listened to you. You could have been on that plane helping those people from the beginning." Sarah nodded but didn't express anger. Her military training had taught her that debriefing and learning from mistakes was more important than assigning blame. The important thing is that everyone survived. Captain Williams and his crew did an excellent job under impossible circumstances. Over the next hour, Sarah found herself at the center of a media storm. News crews arrived to interview the mysterious Falcon, who had saved Flight 892. Airport authorities wanted to understand how a passenger who had been denied boarding had ended up coordinating the emergency response. Federal aviation officials needed detailed reports about the non-standard procedures that had been used. Sarah handled the attention with the same calm professionalism she had shown during combat missions. She deflected credit to Captain Williams and his crew, explained that the passenger's survival had been the result of good training and teamwork, and avoided discussing the classified details of her military service. But privately, she was processing the deeper implications of what had happened. Her removal from Flight 892 had been based on prejudice, fear, and bureaucratic inflexibility. The same government agencies she had served with distinction were now viewing her service record as suspicious. The airline industry's post-9/11 security measures, designed to prevent terrorism, had instead prevented a qualified expert from being in position to help during a genuine emergency. As passengers from Flight 892 were finally transported to the terminal after being evacuated from the aircraft, Sarah watched them reunite with their families. Children ran to parents they had feared they might never see again. Spouses embraced with tears of relief. Business travelers called their offices to report they were alive and safe. Captain Williams sought Sarah out personally to thank her. He was still in his uniform, looking exhausted but grateful. "Falcon, I've been flying for 20 years, but I've never encountered anything like what happened today. Without your guidance, I don't think we would have made it." "You and your crew did the hard part," Sarah replied. Flying that approach with compromised systems required real skill and courage. But you knew what to do when none of us did. Where did you learn emergency procedures like that? Sarah looked around at the crowded terminal, at the news crews and airline officials who were still trying to understand what had happened. Sometimes the skills we learn in one context can be applied to save lives in another context. The important thing is being ready when people need help. Captain Williams nodded, understanding that she wasn't going to elaborate on her classified background. Well, I'm glad you were here today even if you weren't supposed to be on our flight. As the evening wore on and the immediate crisis passed, Sarah finally had time to call her mother. The surgery had been postponed due to an equipment malfunction, which meant Sarah might still be able to drive home and be there in the morning after all. I saw you on the news, her mother said, her voice filled with pride and amazement. My daughter, the hero, saving all those people. I always knew you were special, but I never imagined. I just did what needed to be done, Mom. Nothing special about that. Sarah, there were 180 people on that plane. They're all going home to their families tonight because of you. That's pretty special in my book. As Sarah gathered her belongings to begin the long drive home, Frank Morrison approached her one final time. Miss Chin, I know we got off to a terrible start today, but I want you to know that our airline is reviewing all of our passenger screening procedures. What happened to you should never happen to anyone. Sarah nodded. I hope the review will consider whether security measures are actually improving safety or just creating new problems. Sometimes the people you're most suspicious of are the ones most qualified to help when things go wrong. Frank looked uncomfortable but nodded. We're also going to recommend that you be added to our list of passengers with emergency response qualifications. If something like this ever happens again? I hope it never happens again, Sarah said quietly. But if it does, I'll help however I can. Sarah walked through the terminal toward the parking garage, passing the news crews who were still reporting on the miraculous emergency landing, and the mysterious passenger known only as Falcon. Her phone was buzzing with messages from former military colleagues who had seen the coverage and recognized her call sign. Old friends were reaching out to congratulate her and ask if she was really the Falcon from the old days. But Sarah wasn't interested in the publicity or recognition. She had spent years serving her country in classified operations that would never make the news. Today had been different only because it happened in public, with cameras rolling and reporters asking questions. The core mission remained the same as it had always been, using her skills and training to protect innocent people who couldn't protect themselves. As she drove through the night toward her mother's hospital, Sarah reflected on the strange chain of events that had led to Flight 892's survival. Her removal from the flight had been based on fear, prejudice, and bureaucratic inflexibility. But it had also positioned her to provide help from the ground when the emergency developed. Sometimes injustice and heroism were intertwined in ways that were impossible to predict or understand. The call sign Falcon had opened doors and commanded respect when it mattered most. Years of classified service, combat missions, and special operations had prepared her for a moment she never could have anticipated. And somewhere in the night sky, 180 people were flying safely home because a quiet woman in worn sneakers had refused to let bureaucracy and prejudice prevent her from doing what she did best, saving lives when everything went wrong. Sarah Chen would continue living her quiet civilian life, consulting on defense projects and visiting her mother. But the legend of Falcon had grown a little larger, and the aviation industry had learned that heroes sometimes came in the most unexpected packages, sitting patiently in airport terminals while airline employees made assumptions about who they were and whether they belonged on the plane.